Hey everybody, let's hopefully, yay, there we go. Hi, my name's Martin Woodward. It's Martin Woo at Microsoft.com if you want to send me an email, or at Martin Woodward on Twitter if you want to send me some abuse. That's cool. So we're going to talk about Microsoft, but first we're going to go back into the dark history of Microsoft. So, back before we had fancy color logos, back even before we had high-resolution cinema displays, back before ASCII art, really. So this was before, when my kids know about Bill Gates as this billionaire philanthropist doing amazing good deeds, but it's before then, obviously. It's before he was a heartthrob, lounging around on his computers, and even before he was a criminal, before he got his speeding ticket in Albuquerque. He was actually, him and Paul Allen were doing sort of micro-instrumentation and telemetry systems and programming systems of the early Altair 8800. And when he was doing that, it was with a lot of computer hobbyists, as some people know. And he had early problems back in the beginning days of the company with people sort of sharing the code. And he was trying to sell usage of the code, and he's having people share the code. And Bill Gates wrote a very famous letter to the hobbyists around how most hobbyists are kind of stealing the software. They're just taking these tapes and copying them and sharing them. So, he invited them to kind of pay up if they wanted to. And then, he had some opinions around the GPL, of which his successor kind of had some agreements with. Interestingly, I was involved in the first project that shipped GPL software inside of Microsoft. And that was actually under Steve Ballmer's era back in those days. So I didn't really tell that many people, but we definitely did it back then. But things changed substantially under our new CEO, Satya Nadella. So, Satya's, a guy that's willing to stand up on stage in front of big signs saying, "We love Linux" and things. Now, obviously, Satya's not silly. He's not an idiot. Why do we love Linux? Well, we make a lot of money from Linux now. We run Linux in Azure. Linux is over 50% of the workloads in Azure now. So we've deliberately changed our business models to allow us to work better with open source, not just with Linux, but across the whole board. And I'm going to try and dig into that today a little bit more, and hopefully give you some tips and ideas about how you can help your company do more in open source as well. One of the things that Satya likes to say is, Microsoft's a different company than it was in the past, judge us by our actions today and in the future. But let's have a quick look over the past sort of 5 years. I joined the company in November 2009, which is actually, that's around about the same time Microsoft first started contributing to the Linux kernel. I wasn't part of that work. I came from the Eclipse world, so that's where the sort of background I had. I joined in 2009, and then sort of things started slowly progressing under Ballmer, but then when Satya came in, that's when things really started to escalate. So in, 2009, just quickly, I had to contribute an 18-byte fix to Eclipse so that it could run better on 64-bit Windows. Makes so much sense why we would want to contribute that. And yet there was there was a 10x order of magnitude of the number of people on the email thread that needed to approve this 18-byte fix to Eclipse back then. And then things have changed substantially since those days. So by 2014, we actually created the GitHub organization on the Microsoft organization on GitHub. And that ran on my credit card for a little while. It was kind of quite a sort of, ghetto operation, below the radar operation sort of thing that I just paid for it on my credit card. We're still on the legacy plan, believe it or not. We still pay GitHub all this money for our, even though we bought them, we still pay for our GitHub account. Not on my credit card anymore, thankfully. They take purchase orders nowadays. And I also helped set up the .NET Foundation back then. So that's when we kind of started really getting serious about releasing .NET under an open source license. 2015, Visual Studio Code came out, which a lot of people use nowadays here. Who here is a Visual Studio Code user, out of interest? Awesome, good to see. Right, wow, cool. Okay, and then we joined the Linux Foundation in 2016. So we've gone from Linux is a cancer to joining the Linux Foundation in 2016. That's quite a big change. And then round about where we are nowadays, there are roughly 25,000 Microsoft employees who are on GitHub every single day, contributing to open source. And we have about 8,500, nearly 9,000 open source projects attached to the Microsoft organizations in GitHub. So 2014 was repo number 1, and now we're on repo number 8,800. So that's quite a substantial growth in terms of orgs. And so, yeah, let's dig into that. Let's see how this happened. So I'm going to try and do this in a way that kind of has some lessons to share, so we'll see if it works. The first one, and where most companies start, is learning how to consume open source and learning how to consume it responsibly. If you look at the average sort of enterprise application, 99% of those applications that we deploy today have some open source in them. If you think about, who here deploys an application at work that does not contain open source? There we go, boom. I can't even see a single hand, yep. So there are some people, they tend to work in nuclear submarines and things like that, but, even actually, not a lot of those as well. There's some open source there, believe it or not. And then 90% of that application, or between 80 and 90%, is actually open source code when you look at the amount of code that's there. So we tend to see that organizations are only writing between sort of 10 and 20% of the code that they ship, and the rest of that code is from the open, from open source. If you look at the average project that you deploy, you've got, 12, 20 people working on the project. There's usually about 25,000 contributors to the open source that you're consuming. And that's a huge change in how we build software that's happened in my professional lifetime, and something that we need to make sure we build, processes and help support our organizations when they're doing that. One of the challenges that we're particularly concerned about inside Microsoft is around security. We have in the industry, there's about 1 security researcher for every 570 developers. But inside Microsoft, we're very lucky in that we have about 1 security researcher per 120 developers. So we have a lot of security researchers inside the company helping us do this. But we need to take security very seriously. And we're seeing a rising sort of challenge with people doing supply chain vulnerability attacks, where they're actually trying to put vulnerabilities into downstream open source and then, have you consume them. So we need to help fix this. One of the ways you can fix this, and one of the things that we were doing early on, is by using things like White Source or Sneak, Black Duck, these kind of third-party products. And on the end of your deployment pipeline, on the end of your build pipeline, actually look at the open source that you're consuming and kind of spot known vulnerabilities, or do some static code analysis and that sort of thing, and try and help improve the security of your software. But what we're actually doing as a company now is kind of taking these lessons that we're learning and talking to our friends at GitHub and helping make sure GitHub is building security tooling in. So now inside of open source projects on GitHub, if you're consuming open source inside your project, it actually analyzes your dependencies. It cracks open your node dependencies and things like that, and will tell you, oh, by the way, you're using a vulnerable version of this downstream dependency where we've got a known vulnerability for it. Would you like to fix that? And it'll even help you create a pull request to fix that vulnerability, which makes it really easy. And you can actually, if you're using GitHub, you can use that for the code inside your enterprise as well. We're also recently just acquired a company called Semel, who do advanced sort of pattern recognition, and they allow you to do the secure. And we were using this inside Microsoft for years with our security researchers. So we've acquired that company, and now we're making that available for free to open source projects, but also to people using GitHub for their own work. And that allows you to code up a query which analyzes security vulnerability and then go look for that similar vulnerability in all of your code, not just the code where you found it. And then finally, the GitHub team are doing some really good work making it easier for maintainers to be notified about security vulnerabilities by security researchers so that they don't zero-day all of their consumers by saying, hey, you've got a vulnerability in this library, and tell all the bad guys. It allows them to tell the maintainers privately, allows them to fix a bug privately between the maintainers, and then release that. But also GitHub is now a naming authority, a numbering authority for CVEs, so they can actually create vulnerabilities, as a published thing. And that then allows the quality of these tools that look at known vulnerabilities to get better. So that's some of the work that's happening there to try and improve things. But also, don't be a jerk with the open source that you're consuming. The number of times I've worked with teams where they're treating open source dependencies they have as suppliers that they don't pay any money to, They're just kind of, here, please fix this, please, or just fix this, fix that. And as a maintainer myself of some open source projects, and lots of my friends are maintainers, it's very demoralizing when somebody's being very rude and quite aggressive in certain kind of the issues and the pull requests. Is this project dead? Is like the one that as a maintainer you fear, because you never have enough time to work on your projects. So remember that the open source maintainers don't owe you anything. You're consuming, you've got this stuff for free. So you need to think about how you can give back and how you can structure your company to make sure it gives back to the maintainers. We've also set something up on the GitHub side to actually allow companies, they can send money to maintainers if they want to as well through the GitHub Sponsors program. So enterprises as well as individuals can actually go sponsor people, send them money, and then GitHub give 100% of that money to the developers. And at the minute, we're actually matching up to the first 5,000. So you get Microsoft in effect to give money to your open source projects by you giving money to them. So cool. Finally, Microsoft can pay for all the stuff of the past. Just give some money to open source, and then money comes out of our bank account and goes to the open source maintainer as well. The next one is around, so that's consuming responsibly, but how do you help your business now learn why they need to contribute? The biggest kind of way I've talked about this with managers inside of Microsoft is to explain that when they fork, when they take a copy of an open source project and bring it inside the firewall, and then they make some changes to it, they're now running on a fork, a copy of it. And you're just building up integration debt. So the longer you diverge from the upstream open source project, the harder it is to do a pull and get the very latest, up-to-date security vulnerabilities and features and that sort of thing. So if you don't push your fixes upstream, it makes it harder to pull the new features downstream. And on average, we kind of talk about an 80-20 rule. Even a very active contribution, if you can contribute, a few fixes here and there, that's only, say, 20% of the value of the 80% of the value that you're pulling down again if you manage to push it upstream and then pull down. So we're always encouraging our managers and our teams to push those changes upstream to enable them to then pull changes downstream later on. And it's worth I talk about a contribution funnel inside Microsoft. And this is kind of what happens with open source projects. So 99.9% of people with your open source projects just consume them. They never talk to you. They never tell you they exist, They just drive by, grab your software, maybe even as a dependency from another piece of software, and then run away and you never hear from them. And that's fine, That's completely what this is about. We're sharing. But what you want to do is be as welcoming as you can for that 0.1% of people that are actually going to contribute some time. Maybe they're going to fix a typo, fix a bug. Maybe they're going to blog about, do a conference talk about your library or blog about your library. So you want to encourage that 0.1% of people and make it as easy for them to contribute time as possible. So provide them good documentation, provide some guidance and that sort of thing, contribution guidance. But you also want to increase the amount of people using your library to the widest possible, so you'll get that 0.1% of people turns out to be more than one person, turns out to be significant time. So if you get your open source library used by lots of people, then you can have lots of contribution again. And so to do that, you need to think about, how do I market my library? How do I make the README file approachable? Maybe I have a website which helps people try it out. All those sorts of things you see people doing. That's how you kind of help make your library more successful. Of the people who contribute time, a very, very tiny percentage of them actually get round to contributing code. It's, people have the best of intentions. It's a lot easier to create an issue than it is to actually fix the issue. And again, that's completely fine. Don't assume magic people, magic pixies are going to arrive and give you code. One of the sort of myths that I had to bust inside Microsoft is, we can't afford to, we want to put something open source because we can't afford to maintain it. If you can't afford to maintain it, then don't put it open source, because you need to be able to afford to maintain it, because you're going to be getting pull requests. You need to be able to pull those down and bring those into your library if you want to get any value from this. But of those, a tiny amount of people contribute code, so make it easy and be welcoming. If somebody sends you a pull request, they'll typically send you a quick kind of hello world pull request. They'll fix a small thing somewhere in some part of a library. And if you're responsive to them, if you're welcoming to them, that's when they'll come in and contribute a little bit more. And then eventually, over time, you're trying to sort of foster these people who are contributing fixes and get them to the point where they can help you co-maintain that particular library or that application. As I mentioned, talk is really cheap in open source projects. People have the best of intentions, but if you want to have influence on an open source community, the only way to do that is to contribute to that community. And that's, again, something we had to learn at Microsoft. The only way we can control, we can have any influence in the direction of Chromium or Git or Linux or anything like that isn't by joining a foundation. The foundations don't control the projects, they just support them. It's by being a contributor to that project that then your ideas get attention. Do you get any kind of say in the future direction of that project? So we must understand that contribution is what matters when it comes to having influence inside of an open source community. I'll give you an example that I lived through. So I worked on a program called Team Foundation Server. Back in 2012, it was leading the Gartner Quadrant. It was, awesome. Anybody here use Team Foundation Server or TFVC in the past? Let's see, a couple of people, cool. And, it was doing great. Customers were loving it. They had certain things. And it was using a thing called Team Foundation Version Control, which was a centralized version control system back then. It was inspired by how we did things internally inside Microsoft. It's kind of like Subversion or sort of Perforce, one of those sorts of things. Great for large projects, not so great for small projects. I live in Northern Ireland, and the team are spread around the world, and so I have to do a lot of flying. And one particular time when I was flying between sites, actually over to Seattle, I was reading a book called The Innovator's Dilemma. If you haven't read this, I'd highly recommend that you do. Everybody inside Microsoft should be forced to read this at least once a year, because it helps you identify disruptive technologies and then figure out ways to deal with them. And so I'd read that book, and then I was realizing, distributed version control was getting big back then. Sort of Git and Mercurial were quite big. And what are we going to do about distributed version control? It's obviously a disruptive technology to us. What should we do? And in the old days of Microsoft, it was very easy, we should build a competitor. But, we were just sort of changing around this time. So it's like, well, let's go into open source. Let's maybe work with an open source project. And so look at Git and Mercurial. And back then, it wasn't obvious which was going to win. They were both fairly popular. And in fact, if you talk to lots of people on the Windows platform, Mercurial was kind of preferred because Mercurial was more user-friendly, which it still is, and better on Windows. But we sort of sat and thought to ourselves, well, if the rest of the world, including Linux, is on Git, we don't want this Windows community being left behind, if this is where things are going. We don't want it bifurcating. We need them to come together. And if the problem with Git is that it doesn't run well on Windows, I think I know somebody who can help with that, you know? So we actually got the Windows team to adopt Git themselves and move them to Git. And then with that, it obviously encourages contributions to be made to the Git open source project to make it work really well on Windows. And that's what we did. Some other things that we did is we open sourced .NET, as I mentioned. And it's to the point now where the majority of merges that happen in .NET come from outside of Microsoft. You know, when you've got companies like Red Hat, Google, AWS, Samsung, all these sorts of people contributing to .NET, it's not just Microsoft driving it forwards, then you get a lot more successful. And that was a long process of enabling these people around the community, but also these organizations, to gain confidence in contributing, that they'd be welcome, and then eventually get to the point where they're willing to take on a role as sort of helping steer the direction of the technology in the future. Visual Studio Code, which you all use, everybody knows. It's got over 19,000 contributors. It's like the biggest contributed open source project in GitHub, which is awesome. And we've also got other projects that have just come about recently. I heard I was coming to a cinema, so I went and got a nice video to put up on the screen. The Windows Terminal, whoop-de-doo. Who'd have thought that the Windows Terminal needed an advertising video? But hey, it looks cool. The Windows Terminal is now open source. And it's available. And you'll notice like the Windows calculator and components. So while Windows itself isn't open source and you wouldn't want to try and build it, trust me, the parts of Windows are becoming open source, are being modularized and separated out. When we do this, people obviously always ask me, whenever we release something as open source, I always get asked, are you going to open source like Windows or, different things? They name your favorite application, Windows Media Center or whatever, or Microsoft Bob, when we open source Microsoft Bob. And the answer is, for things like Microsoft Bob, never, because as I say, it's not something we're wanting to actively maintain. And there's not a huge amount of value in it. It turns out these images are actually like 16 color images. They're not even very good. So when do we release something as open source? And how does that kind of fit into our strategy? There's roughly sort of 3 categories. The first one is around being agile. So with things like .NET or TypeScript or even Chromium, trying to get people to try the latest versions of things is super, super hard. But if you make them open source, for instance, .NET is a great example. Getting somebody to update to the latest .NET framework version is really hard. You make it open source, you're getting live feedback on the very latest commit, onto CI, onto your very latest push that you've made to the repository. And so if we move the whole team into open source, we're now getting live feedback on the direction of the project of something that would have been very difficult to get feedback on. When you do DevOps, it's all about idea to data. How quickly can you go from your idea to getting it shipped, to getting data back to help you learn? You're trying to complete that feedback loop as quickly as possible. And by going open source with some of these projects and by changing the business models to allow us to, it allows us to get feedback. Originally, Visual Studio Code was released as open source primarily to make it go as wide as possible, get it on as many operating systems, as many Linux distributions, want it to go as wide as possible. But it's more often now, it's actually helping us build VS Code because we've got so many contributors. But the original business reason why we released it was to get broad distribution. And then we've got communities such as Linux, Kubernetes, Git, where we're working and building services that we charge money for on top of that open source project. But we're working with markets that are all open source and using it as a standard. And so we work with that market and then we get a bigger kind of customer base, access to a bigger customer base. Here are some business goals. If you hear, then you go, no. That is not the reason why you ship as open source. So I used to hear these all the time inside of Microsoft. We're going to do it because it's good PR, yeah? Well, PR is great, but a short-term PR hit is never going to give you the ability to make a lasting impact on your project. Remember, open source people value contribution. If you come in, go, la, 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 make a big fuss, and then disappear, that's worse than they've never been there at all, really. So we need to make sure contributions that we make are lasting engagements, are, are commitments, not just PR exercises. Goodwill is another one. Oh, people will love us if we contribute to open source. Great. People do like Microsoft better. It's certainly a lot easier, it's certainly more fun coming to events now as a Microsoft person because people think, oh, that's cool. That's not a reason to make stuff open source. Karma's awesome, goodwill is awesome, but you can't take goodwill and karma to Wall Street or to the bank and earn money, we're running a business. So these are benefits you get, but they're not the business case. The last one is around recruitment. Oh, if we do this as open source, it'll help us recruit. And again, it's a lot easier now for us to hire people inside Microsoft. Now we're a lot more open source friendly. But that is not the reason to ship something as open source. Right. Next thing you've got to do is convince everybody else in the business. We're all convinced. So the first thing you've got to do is convince your co-workers, convince your team. We're engineers, we're developers. How on earth do we do that? We're really, really bad usually at talking to people, okay? So one of my tips was to actually go talk to the salespeople, the sales team. They're usually the people I avoid as a developer because I kind of get the stink of salesperson rubbed off on me. But if you go talk to the sales team, quite often they will talk to you about the business case, why you're doing something. And if you can explain it with them, they'll work with you, challenge your assumptions. And once they're convinced that the company can make more money working this way, salespeople are awesome at convincing people. That's their job. And so they can then help you persuade others inside of the business that maybe this is a good idea. The next thing is management. You need to go talk to your management team and see if you can convince them. Now, I'm quite, lucky with my management, so that's not too much of a problem for me. But when you are talking to your management, it's around, showing the numbers, showing the business value, and often the salespeople help you do that. The next conversation you need to have is with your lawyers quite often. This is always a scary moment when you go talk to the lawyers. I'm really lucky in my legal team. So I went to go talk to the legal team inside Microsoft. This is them. So they were quite open source friendly, it's fair to say. So the important thing to remember when you're working with your lawyers is you own the business. The lawyers don't own the business. You own the business strategy for your products. You're the product owner. You're responsible for releasing the product and for shipping and ensuring you're compliant. The lawyers are there to advise you about risk management, to advise you how to take risks that are within your pay grade. So if I want to do something and maybe Satya should approve this, then they can help you with those kind of decisions. They can make sure you don't damage Microsoft, financially or, legally or whatever. And they can also keep you out of jail. Lawyers are quite good at that. So, but remember, you're there to work with them as a team. You don't ask permission. You work as a team to figure out, this is the business reason for doing this. How can we do this with the minimum possible risk to the company? After lawyers, you need to go to your senior leadership. So again, super lucky now. My boss is a guy called, my direct boss is a guy called Nat Friedman, who's also the CEO of GitHub, so he kind of gets open source. Then his boss is a guy called Scott Guthrie, who did some of the first open source projects in the company, and then Satya Nadella, who quite likes open source, it turns out. So that's easy for me, but hey, this is why they call it work. That might be a bit harder in your organization, so sorry about that. Next one is go talk to your customers. This was actually one of the harder things for us in Microsoft, helping make sure our customers were happy with the open source transition. When we're doing .NET, making sure companies who weren't as used to consuming open source understood that they could consume open source, they could consume .NET from Microsoft, and we would ship it under a Microsoft license to them, and they can still consume it with the same, legal risk and indemnity and blah, blah, blah. Or they can go for the open source version if they want to take latest, from the CI branch, they can do that as well. So working with your customers is also vitally important so they understand where you're going. Right, stakeholders convinced. Next, keeping it legal. So we mentioned the legal team. They're going to help you manage your risks. You're going to work with them. You need to help educate them quite often in terms of software, and as well as them helping educate you. But also, when you're doing, one of the things I talk about in Microsoft a lot is People understand licenses in Microsoft. You know, that's how a lot of the money was made, from licensing software. So the way I describe it is, if we want everybody else to respect our licenses, then we must respect the licenses of all the software that we're touching and consuming. You know, that's vitally important. So help do that, help sort of explain what the different license types are with your legal team, and then try and look at tooling to help you automate some of the compliance scanning. Again, tools like White Source and Black Duck and Sneak and things like that help make sure you're shipping things in licenses that you can distribute, you know, that you're able to distribute outside to your customers. Finally, don't be afraid of open source. Most contributors to open source want you to use their software. Even Microsoft, you know, sometimes when we would come in, they're like, not sure. But most times, people want you to use their software. I personally contribute to an organization called the Software Freedom Conservancy, who, as well as supporting the Git project, they also help make sure that people are adhering to GPL license and things like that. And it's a cool organization, so I personally support those types of organizations and encourage you to. But do what you can in the industry to kind of help make sure it's kept legal. Next, be part of the community. So we were looking at, like, Microsoft Edge now has adopted Chromium. Take it. Does everybody know that? Yeah, kind of. So the new Edge browser is being based on top of a Chromium engine. Like, how does that, why? You know, that seemed obviously like that's an interesting decision. But it makes a ton of sense, you know, by contributing to Chromium, with Chrome being one of the biggest applications that's installed on Windows as well, by switching the engineering team to contribute to Chromium, anything we're contributing to that application then filters up, regardless of where people are consuming that open source code, whether it's Edge or even Chrome. It also affects not just our own platform, but everybody else's platform. So we've, you know, improved things like the ARM64 support. ARM64 support for Chrome wasn't there. It's now there, you know, because of some of the contributions that we're making. And that benefits everybody. The important thing is that open source is not a zero-sum game. By working together on these applications, we can make sure that we mutually benefit. You know, it's not one person has to lose for, you know, to another person's benefit. You can contribute and have both people benefit. And especially with a lot of the contributions that Microsoft make, you know, it benefits us somewhere. So it's often quite easy to figure out a way. With the .NET project about being in the community, one thing I learned, we released .NET as open source very early. I think 2012 maybe, something like that, quite early. But, and in fact, .NET's always had parts of it kind of open. And we've always had open design notes. That was sort of how it was. We went, I'm trying to remember when it was now, I think it was around about 2000. It was definitely after I joined the company. So 2012, sometime around then, we first released .NET as a Roslyn compiler as open source. So we released it under an open source license. But the way that we were doing it was kind of a bit like how Android's done, where we were publishing as open source. We weren't living open source. We were just publishing the source under an open source license. And that's okay. That's good. But the problem with that is you get limited contribution back because people can't see what's happening. The biggest change for us was when we made the jump and we moved to moving all the engineering teams to GitHub, contributing every day to the .NET projects as if they're just contributing. That's just their job, to contribute to these projects. They just happen to be public and open source on GitHub. And they follow the same rules, the same procedures, you know, the same PR workflow that anybody outside of Microsoft follows. And by making it democratic and making it so that everybody contributes the same way, that's how you get true community engagement and buy-in. You then need to go improve a bunch of your documentation because you find there's a lot of tribal knowledge, which people inside, you know, Building 18 in Microsoft kind of understand. But if we need to make it distributed across the world, then we need to improve a lot of the documentation, help people contribute, and start to encourage people into a shared ownership. All the fun you have in teams, you want to try and think of ways you can take that fun and take it out and bring it out into the open as well. So we would do things like when people contributed to different projects, we would take a mug and we would laser etch their commit ID into the mug and ship it to them, if it was a cool contribution. And then we've actually scaled that up now within the .NET Foundation where people can nominate, great contributions and they'll send them a gift and things. But we just tried to have a bit of fun with this, but also as well as doing this cool stuff, saying thank you, we also would kind of sneak some of these things in. So, you have these videos that execs do in Microsoft in conferences, and this was one that Guthrie did, and we actually snuck into the video just a quick, 2-second, like him having one of these mugs. So the 50, 60 people in the world that also had one of these mugs knew what that joke was, and that was an insider joke just for those people, and not, nobody else kind of noticed it was there. But just have fun with your community. Treat them as part of the team. You are the community. Don't think of us versus the community. It's the community of which we are a member as well. Step 6 in the 7-step plan is to have some success. You might think that comes last, but you need to learn. So you need to show some early wins to then get people on board. When we started doing the Git stuff, Git wasn't really used by anybody. TFVC and Subversion were the biggest used systems for source control in developers. Now, Git is by far the winner. TFVC is still used by a lot of people, and scarily, people are still using file shares and zip files and Dropbox for source control. Blows my mind, but there we go. Hey-ho. So, and then you get on Hacker News, right? When we got Windows onto Git, it became the largest repo, and so cool. And all these bits of success help different parts of the organization go, oh, wow, they're doing something cool. Let's try and do that. Let's do more of that. Success leads to behavior. So, have positive reinforcement with your teams. If we look at .NET, into 2015, just after we opened it up to the .NET Foundation, we were kind of getting contributions from around the world a little bit, which I was quite cool about. But as we go through the years, you can see the contributions are now coming from all over the world, not just from Washington State anymore. And that just that's winning. That's awesome. It means we're getting all this diversity of thought, of use cases, of people contributing into this project, which is just brilliant and so healthy. And obviously, you have, when you get these projects and you work at big scale, and you get to go into big charts and things, which is cool. But people send you cool stuff as well. Like, David Fowler is literally one of the smartest people I know. Microsoft, I like to say, has got the greatest sort of standard deviation of intelligence of any place I've worked at. I'm a physicist, so, I've worked with the same idiots I work with everywhere, okay? Microsoft's a big company. You've got the same kind of people you work with everywhere, but then you work with actual geniuses that are around the corridor occasionally. David Fowler, I had class as one of those. He's an amazing guy. And then he was, reviewing this pull request, and he was like, wow, look at this. It improves the performance of Cathedral, like the built-in web server in .NET. It uses I can't even pronounce that, Debruggen table? I don't know, however you say it. He had no idea what one is. I have no idea what one is. But by using it, it made the ASP.NET like a microsecond faster. Awesome, that was just brilliant. So even the smartest people in the world that we have some of the smartest people in the world. Turns out all the smart people in the world don't work in your company. So, you get lots of sharing of ideas. We had a company called Peach Pie have taken .NET and compiled PHP and run it a lot quicker, which is cool. Never would have thought of that. People have built IDEs. This is Project Rider, so in like Visual Studio for Linux and things like this. And built IDEs for even the iPad as well, which has got like live code editing, which is cool. None of these things did we set out as our business case of why we were going to open source. They were just happy surprises. So have success. That's awesome. The last thing that was the most surprising thing for me was around inner source. So when I joined Microsoft back in 2009, gosh, 10 years ago, this comic came out from a guy called Manu Gournet. So I'll just skip back a bit. It shows you the tech companies, and there's Microsoft. And I came through acquisition. That's very much what Microsoft felt like, with these different organizations kind of not talking to each other very well, as how I put it politely. By doing more open source inside the company, it's actually taught us to share and to collaborate better inside the company as well. And we talk about inner source. So being able to share within the teams. And we've noticed that happening inside the culture. So we've actually changed our incentives package inside Microsoft. So when you're demonstrating impact at the end of the year, you don't just say, what impact did I have? What did I invent? You have to say, which things did you build on from others? And which things did you do that others built on? So we're encouraging this collaboration across the business all the way into our incentive structure, as well as in the tooling that we do, making code. By now, I can go view the code for Notepad in Windows, make a pull request to make it, Unix line ending support, and submit that if I wanted to. I actually tried once and I failed, but it's coming now. Yay. So, you can make these changes. And it's not just, we don't just see this inside Microsoft. We see this happening in all sorts of organizations as well, where they're seeing massive productivity gains and massive amounts of collaboration by bringing these open source kind of workflows and ideas and methodologies and applying them inside the firewall as well to private source code. I know I had one inside Microsoft. I mentioned working with geniuses. A guy called Anders Hallsberg. Do you know Anders Hallsberg? He sort of did a lot of work on, Pascal and Delphi and things. And then, invented the .NET language, helped invent TypeScript. I remember talking to him about TypeScript. And I was like, nah, that's never going to take off, Anders. I don't know what you're wasting your time on. And turns out I was wrong and Anders was right, as he always is. Anders is on GitHub, contributing every single day. You can go follow Anders and go look at the code that he's doing. That's just amazing. But I knew that we'd got value, we'd got some culture change inside the organization. Microsoft's still very email-centric. We have Teams, but we've still lots of email. People send out email when they have babies. That's all, what they do, celebrating things or that sort of thing. Somebody sent out an email saying they'd had a baby. The first reply was +1 looks good to merge. I was like, yes, open source has won. We've got the culture change. You have to be a little bit careful, though, in GitHub profiles. This is .NET Bot, which is a bot we have, which does some automation for us on the .NET projects. It's cool. It does a lot of work, does a lot of activity. The interesting thing is, it also does a lot of activity against some of the busiest projects in GitHub. And we've actually found .NET Bot has started getting emails from recruiters offering it jobs. But then I realized this is probably a robot that's sending out the emails. So robots are offering robots jobs now. We're all doomed. Okay. Anyway, that's how to do open source, and that's how to have success in your company. So I hope that was a little bit useful. I'm just a small part of this change. I did some work inside Microsoft, helped create the org. I'm just one of thousands of people inside Microsoft that are contributing to open source. But what I wanted to do was to thank you. Thank you for being part of us with this journey, for sitting through this talk, but also really for kind of helping change Microsoft, sort of one pull request at a time. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the talk. That was a really cool talk.
Thank you.
And I think we have time for one question.
Okay.
So maybe you can help me choose. I'm not sure which one we should pick.
Yeah.
That's not on topic.
Yeah. So there's a couple of questions like why did some projects get open sourced and say they'll accept contributions and then they don't take the pull request? We have, not every team. We're building up the experience in each team on how to sort of merge these. So we are working with all the different teams, and we are trying to sort of send them more emails and things when they're not having contributions. And the last one
was, this one.
Yeah, when will Windows be released on GitHub? Yeah, I don't know. And, I doubt in my lifetime, but components of it already are. So there we go. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.